Right, here we are. I'm going to play that previous track again. In case you're wondering, anybody out there, it's Irish harp music. Music of the Irish harp. The Sally Gardens. W.B. Yeats wrote a beautiful love poem too. Hello to everybody who's signing in. Welcome. And from the far-flung fields of Greensburg, PA, and Haarlem in the Netherlands, and all places between, welcome. Yes, Dennis, I wondered why you needed help in Greensburg, but it's nice for you to say hello. Dear to you, James. And I missed you, Joan, but say hello to you. Oh, I tell you, John, I have looked a little better, maybe about 30 years ago, but anyway. One of the great truths of the Irish harp and Irish harp music is that it's seldom jolly. But I find it remarkably restive. Hello, Karen from Scott. Welcome back. And, Alma, yes, it is a beautiful day. I hope everybody's having a beautiful day. It's quite a beautiful day here in Regent Square in Pittsburgh. It's lovely out there. I'll be actually mentioning that fact. There's actually an Irish harp festival in Ireland. A friend of mine runs it, and I was down to. I actually opened it one year, and it's quite extraordinary listening. It's there's a different sensuality to the Irish harp as opposed to the concert harp, and listening to it being played almost like a folk instrument. It's just extraordinary. This is really good. It can chime like bells, and it can have that same sensuality as a cello could have. It's an extraordinary instrument. I have to lean forward to see who's on because I'm old and losing the eyesight. Very funny, Anne. Like that. Hello, Robert from Fort Lauderdale. I'm assuming it's sunny down there. Now that's not an Irish air, that's a Scottish air, but we'll forgive them because they're Celtic. This isn't O'Carolan, but there is some O'Carolan on it. Sorry, my goodness me, I'm losing my... O'Carolan was the famous blind Irish harpist, and he composed so many airs. They were absolutely wonderful. He was closest to come to jolly harp music. The Carolan Concerto has a kind of almost a jig-like rhythm to it that's quite fun. Judy in Rochester. Glorious day in Rochester. Rochester is wonderful in the sense that you get these wonderful summers. Upstate New York is wonderful for that. Absolutely gorgeous summers and Antarctic winters. I had a friend who was from Rochester and had gone to New York, went to college, traveled around, was actually here in college as well in Pittsburgh at one point. And this is a friend from a long time ago, but eventually moved back to Rochester and then decided that he needed to move because he couldn't take any more Rochester winters. So he decided to go somewhere sunny and ended up on Saipan in the South Pacific, which is, I suppose, quite an alternative to upstate New York. Hi from Lebanon. Hi here from Regent Square. We'll be starting soon. That's an example of why I love Irish harp music. It's like liquid. You don't even get that sense of something being plucked. It's just liquid. It flows off the hands. It's beautiful. You're welcome, Mark. He had a damaged eye. That's the reason for the patch. I think he also thought it made him look like a pirate. I like that. I went to Stanford for much better weather. Well, you know, I wouldn't sort of push it, but one could go to any Stanford for anything better, dare I say. Well, I just did. Hello, Hazel. Lovely to not see you, but know that you're there. I can't see any of you, but it's nice to know you're all out there. Ah, lovely. I could just sit and listen to this all afternoon and forget the webinar, but anyway. Well, I suppose we should make a start. So, beautiful harp music or not, we'll have to turn it down and start talking about our topic for the day. Now, a couple of things first. Well, actually, the first thing I want to say is I am no expert on the topic of James Joyce. I know the topic. I know the books. I've read I've read three of them. One of them multiple times, one of them a few times, and there is one of them that I have tried and failed miserably, and that is Finnegan's Wake, which is an exercise in linguistics that is beyond my humble brain. But there are experts in this world who can quote James Joyce historically and artistically till to their dying breath. I am not one of them. But the purpose of today is not for me to demonstrate my knowledge of the subject. The purpose of today is to introduce you and to say, we, those of us who know something of it, and we at PICT and I, want you to, as it were, dip your toe, if you never have, to dip your toes into the water of James Joyce, because there is something extremely special about it, something very special about him, about his achievements, about what he wrote, that, again, changed the face. And I'm always talking about Irish writers who changed the face of literature. We did a 5-episode series on the 5 playwrights who changed English theatre. We've talked about revolutions in writing from some Irish writers. And for instance, Oscar Wilde being one of them, with Salomia, we talked for 2 programs about that. James Joyce is in that category of earth-shatteringly, mind-bogglingly amazing in terms of what he contributed. So, as I say, I am no expert, but I'm going to do my best to give you a brief introduction to this particular novel and why we revere it and why we celebrate it. Now, we're going to be celebrating it more specifically next Tuesday. On next Tuesday, we are going to be doing some readings from the book. It's a great tradition in many cities, and particularly in Dublin, for obvious reasons, that this particular day, the 16th of June, is celebrated. And we have, in Dublin, I was the master of ceremonies for it for several years, major events, major readings. People actually used to get out onto the streets to open air cafes to eat the Bloomsday breakfast, the breakfast that Leopold Bloom eats in the novel. There's a kind of serious reality to the way Bloomsday is considered, and Bloom and Joyce's creation of Bloom has created its own reality. It's something really rather special. It's not quite up there with St. Patrick's Day, but it's pretty damn close. So what we're planning, as I say, we're going to have some readings throughout the day, starting at noon, and the last reading I think will be at 7 o'clock, so that makes 8 readings. And you can access them. If you go to our Facebook page, you'll find a link. And if you go to our website, you'll find a link, and it's going to be a Zoom presentation. We don't normally do Zoom presentations, but on this day, we're going to do that. It's not continuous. There will be, as I say, 8 readings on the hour, so that's noon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And you tune in on the Zoom and you will get the list. We will have what the readings are on the website so that you'll have a kind of program, and they are being read by some of our PICT artists that you will recognize and know. And we ask very, very humbly for as much donation as you can offer, because all the donations that we can accrue on that day for each of the readings or during the course of the day, all of that, whatever it is, will be divided equally between each of the PICT artists who are doing the reading. PICT doesn't get anything out of this. I don't get anything out of this. This goes straight to the artists who will be doing the readings. And as I say, there are 8 of them. You'll recognize the faces, you'll recognize the voices, you'll recognize the talent. And we ask you on Bloomsday, on Tuesday, if you're not doing anything else, and in this present time, what else would you be doing? Please tune in. So on the Facebook, on the website, the link is there. Go to it every hour on the hour from noon until 7 on Tuesday the 16th. So, as I say, this is a kind of introduction to James Joyce and the book. And if you've never read it, all we want you to do is give the book a try. So, right now, it is a beautiful, bright, late spring day in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And I hope it is wherever you are, but it's really gorgeous out there now. On such a day in June, in the imagination of James Joyce, Leopold Bloom ventured forth across the city of Dublin, just as Odysseus ventured forth across the wild seas to return to his beloved Penelope in Ithaca. And as Homer traced the journey of Odysseus in the Odyssey, we trace the steps of Bloom, hour by hour, through the course of a single day that has now entered the literary canon as Bloomsday, which is a Bloomsday in the imagination of James Joyce was June the 16th, 1904. And that day, we follow this man, Leopold Bloom, and another gentleman, Stephen Dedalus, on their journeys, and as they cross, encounter one another and eventually come together, with Bloom returning to his Penelope, Molly, his wife. That's essentially the book. And the various encounters along the way are what makes it fascinating, and I'll come to that. A little bit about himself. James Augustine Aloysius Joyce. They gave people huge names in those days, didn't they? James is like Oscar Wilde had 5 names, you know. Anyway, James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, born at 41 Brighton Square, Rathgar, Dublin. Actually, very dear friends of mine had lived in that house. I think they still do. And it has a very rusty plaque on the wall. And the one complaint they always had was that right through the summer, they would always walk out the front door and there'd be a lot of Japanese tourists taking photographs of it all the time. It can be a curse living in a house of fame. He was born on the 2nd of February, 1882. And he left this mortal coil on the 13th of January, 1941. So he was literally just short of his 60th birthday. Not a vastly long life, but an incredibly filled one. I'm not going to do a major history of him, but that was his span. He was 60 years of age. He lived 10 years longer than Oscar Wilde. He was a writer. That was what he was, but that is a complete understatement. An understatement of what I would describe as ginormous proportion. Aside from being a poet of some substance and a teacher and a critic, he was a novelist. And again, the term novelist is something of an understatement for what he actually achieved in his writing. His fascination with language, his fascination with imagery, and his, I suppose one might say, he dynamically changed the entire course of novel writing, of writing the form of the novel, so completely, in the way that in the 1800s, Jane Austen defined what a novel was in a way that it had never been defined before, in the way the Brontes had defined storytelling in a way that was far richer, especially Charlotte, that had never been really achieved before. In the very early part of the 20th century, James Joyce completely changed the form of the novel and how it was structured, how it was written. He redefined the whole meaning of the form and the substance, the form and substance in the art of novel writing. And that was a major achievement. I mean, by anybody's standard, we have so many things to thank him for in terms of the way that novels are composed and can be composed. But he introduced a scheme of writing that has been followed and mimicked and copied generationally ever since. When he was a boy, he was actually a rather brilliant student. He had a huge intellect, shining intellect, it was described as, which was not necessarily a good thing in the dark, depressing days of Holy Catholic and largely anti-intellectual Ireland of the time. Now, he was born when Ireland was still part of the United Kingdom. He was born at a time of social fervor, He was born at and growing up at a time when the idea of Irish independence was again beginning to ferment. He was there at the time of the uprising. He was there as the process of the struggle for independence came, but he was a Catholic. All the writers, most of the writers we've talked about, the Irish writers we talked about, were Protestant. He was Catholic, but don't for a moment think that that was what defined him. He started his schooling with the Christian Brothers. It's a very famous school in Dublin, the O'Connell School, very famous Christian Brothers school. But back in the day, it would have been a very strict and a very depressing place. He moved with thanks to the fact that his father got more money, he moved to the much more challenging schools of the Jesuits, and both Clongowes, which was in the country, and Belvedere, which was in the city, and moved back and forth. The mobility of his education was used, I think, pretty much due to his father's, shall we say, unpredictable finances. And when you have to pay for your education, or you want to pay for your education, and in those days you had to pay for your education, and it was the church that dominated education. In fact, when the Irish state was established, De Valera actually basically gave health and education over to the church, and the church was Catholic. But there, in the constitution that established the Irish state, the church was given a preeminent, or the Catholic Church, a preeminent position. It was the special relationship with the Catholic Church. So you were going to be educated, you were going to be educated in a church school. After that, he went on to university, and he went to University College Dublin, which was the Catholic university. It was established by Cardinal Newman, who was an interesting Catholic cardinal, in that he'd started his life as an Episcopalian, as an Anglican, and had converted to Catholicism and ended up wearing a red hat and establishing schools all over the place. University College Dublin was established as a university for Catholics because Catholics at that time were basically forbidden by their own church from attending Trinity College, which was the Protestant heart of learning in Ireland. And as I've said before, people like, Wilde and Farquhar and Sher, they went to Trinity. That was the center. There were no Catholics in Trinity. In fact, I can remember, and it's probably nearly 40 years ago now, when the first Catholic Mass was spoken in Trinity College, when the barriers began to come down. And there was always a degree of tolerance in the Republic, but it took an awfully long time for Trinity to accept a Catholic Mass, and it took an awfully long time. And the death of a particular Cardinal Archbishop of Dublin, John Charles McQuaid, he needed him to die before things like that could happen. So this is the kind of world that Joyce, a free-thinking, highly liberal, fundamentally atheist person, is growing up in, and the intellect trying to express itself. So again, I'm not going to do long histories, but after he graduated, he moved to Europe with his then inamorata, Nora Barnacle. And he basically stayed there as a permanent exile. He was living in various times in Trieste, in Paris, in Zurich. Zurich was his last, as it were, resting place. He rejected the Ireland of the early 20th century because of this oppressive, overbearing Catholic dogmatism. Now, that doesn't mean he left Ireland. He would keep coming back. They did return to Dublin on several occasions. And Dublin, the city, would always be the center of his writing. The heart of his writing was Dublin, not Ireland, Dublin, specifically, absolutely. And because he recognized it as in a way the embryonic center of cityness. And just as New York is not America, Paris is not France. Berlin is not Germany. Dublin is not Ireland. These cities are entities within themselves, and for him, Dublin was the quintessential entity around which all his writing and thinking centered. And as I say, this absolute preoccupation. He said, and I'm quoting, "For myself, I always write about Dublin because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities in the world. In the particular is contained the universal." That phrase, "in the particular is contained the universal," is beautiful. It's a magnificent summation of the understanding that if we want to, it's like all literature, all theatre, write about what you know. If you write about what you know and you write about it with great truth and great understanding, you are then writing about everything. But if you try to write about everything, you will fail. Write about the particular, and in the particular is contained the universal. It's one of my favorite quotes. Dublin, as I say, in the heart of everything that he wrote. And Ulysses, or Ulysses, whichever way you want to pronounce it, I don't mind, in particular is set with that precision of observation, getting into the heart of the city and understanding it. It literally is the precision within the streets and alleyways of the city. It's like, it's a map of the city. He said that if the city were lost, he could be reconstructed from the text of Ulysses. This is the quote: "If Dublin were to be destroyed in some catastrophe, it could be rebuilt brick by brick, using my work as a model." Something of an exaggeration, probably, but what he wanted to do was to represent the city with as great a passion and great an accuracy as he could achieve. So when he was writing it, and he set it in 1904, so he used the 1904 edition of Tom's Directory. It was like, the sort of the street map that you can go and buy now of New York or London or whatever city, but the Tom's Directory listed in it not just the street map, but it listed the owners and tenants of every single residential and commercial property in the city. So he had at his disposal every inch of the city and who owned what at his disposal when he started the writing of the book. And he also would get right to all his friends, knowing where they lived and where they moved and where they worked, and was asking for a constant supply of information, so that he built up this, in his mind, as an imagination, he built up an almost Legoland of Dublin in 1904, and most specifically on the 16th of June, 1904. Now, the book doesn't glamorize Dublin, by no means. Much of what he described is Dublin's squalor, the poverty, the monotony of it, the grayness of it. But it does describe it with a deep affection. And not just for the city itself, but for its occupants. The people that he creates within this novel are wonderfully human, wonderfully Dublin. And he writes with a deep and, being Irish, satiric humor. So, the action of the novel. What is the story? What's it about? The characters and incidents of the Odyssey of Homer in modern Dublin, and that's basically it. He takes the form and structure of Homer's Odyssey, and Odysseus and Ulysses are the same person. It's just different. Some Odysseus, Ulysses, one and the same person. So where Homer called his the Odyssey, in modern Dublin, takes the main characters of the Odyssey, which is Odysseus, Penelope, his wife, and Telemachus, his son. And these are represented in Ulysses as Leopold Bloom, his wife Molly, and Stephen Dedalus, who is not Bloom's son, but it represents that character. So they are paradoxically, it's a kind of parody, as they are contrasted with the characters out of Homer, which are elevated by Homeric poetry and Homeric art and the legend and all of that journey of Odysseus back to Ithaca and all the things that he had to encounter. The book is written in 18 chapters, each one covering roughly an hour of the day, beginning at around 8 in the morning and ending a little bit after, maybe about 2 a.m. in the morning the following day. So an 18-hour period captured in 18 chapters of the book, describing the journey of Leopold Bloom back to Ithaca, back to Eccles Street, back to Penelope / Molly, his wife. Each of the chapters is written in a slightly different literary style, well, in some cases a completely different literary style. Each chapter also refers to a specific episode in Homer's Odyssey. And each chapter has, as it were, a specific color, art, or science that anchors it, and also a bodily organ associated with it. And I won't go into this too deeply about what bodily organs they are, but suffice it to say that it is rich. So this is, it's been described as a kind of kaleidoscopic writing. There is a formality to the way it's structured. He follows a very strict pattern because he's sticking with Homer as his guide. This schematic structure represents, is one of the major contributions that the book has made to the development of 20th century novel writing, of modernist literature. No novel prior to Ulysses had such a form and such a schematic. Joyce, I'm quoting here, virtually introduced the concept of stream of consciousness into the form of the novel. Now, we all know what we mean by stream of consciousness. I mean, for those of whatever you read, I mean, to me, my favorite analogy of it is that there wouldn't be Raymond Chandler. The character of Philip Marlowe wouldn't exist but for Ulysses, because that wonderful capacity that Chandler has as a writer, where you get phrases constantly coming in that are not spoken, but are in the stream of consciousness of the character of Philip Marlowe. She kissed me. She gave me a kiss that I could feel in my hip pocket. That would not exist, I believe, but for James Joyce's Ulysses. He brought this new aspect to writing, that you were not constantly being told what was happening or why it was happening, but you were listening to the thought process behind it happening. The constant consideration by the narrative line. Now, he also used classic mythology, obviously, because he's using Homer and the Odyssey as the framework of the book. And he actually admitted it himself. It was a kind of near obsessive focus on external detail in a book in which much of the significant action is happening inside the minds of the character. That notion of the stream of consciousness. Whatever's going on outside, what you are reading about is what the characters think about, rather than the partaking in the actual action. It is the observation of the action that dominates the book, and that's what makes it so fascinating. It is as much about what is thought and what is considered as it is about actual acting. And this was a really, really new departure. This was examining imagined characters in a way that nobody had really done it before. Everything before this was always based on action and reaction. This is based on consideration and reconsideration. It changed the world. However, Joyce himself complained about it. Once, and a good sign of any good writer is that he is his first and best critic. He said, and I'm quoting again, "I may have over systemized Ulysses. What he did, he played down the mythic correspondences by eliminating, in fact, even the chapter titles. He didn't want anybody to know what was going on in that sense by not putting, he didn't want to put chapter titles or anything into it. He wanted it to have its own natural flow. It wasn't, in fact, until 1930 that the Homeric titles were added to the chapters when it was being finally published as a book. He wanted, in a way, that he didn't want it to be thought of as another version of the Odyssey. He wanted it to stand by itself as its own achievement. But for the sake of clarity, he then was persuaded to put the chapter titles in, and they refer specifically to the Odyssey and to the sequences within that. But it wasn't something when he was writing the novel that he was engaged with. Now, as I mentioned earlier on, although he's best known for Ulysses, which finally, as it were, materialized around 1922, his other works were of equal intensity and complexity. Now, if you've never read any of Joyce, then the best starter thing to read is Dubliners. It's a book of short stories, and they are quite beautiful and simple. Once you get into it, once you realize that there is always that notion of consideration and reconsideration, that stream of consciousness is always there, inherent with everything that he writes. But the book of short stories of Dubliners is wonderful because it is a wonderful introduction to the nature of Dublin and the style of Dublin at the end of that period when it was still a British city. And remember, it was the second city of the British Empire. There were more soldiers billeted in Dublin than there were anywhere else in the United Kingdom. And also Dublin at that point had the biggest red light district of anywhere, possibly in the world. They did say there were more prostitutes per square foot in Dublin than anywhere else. And it was an area around what was Montague Street, known affectionately as the Monto. And if you've ever heard of the Dubliners, you will find one of their songs, "Take me up to Monto, Langaroo." Langaroo means drunk. Let me go to the Monto when I'm drunk. So Dublin was very much an Irish city and a British city. That's what made it so wonderfully unique. And I think that's one of the things that made it such a subject of complete fascination, that in the one bar, you could have two people, one arguing for God Save the King and the other saying Erin go Bra, and then they buy each other pints. Dublin was a remarkable city in that period, and out of that came the explosion of revolution and of art and of everything else that makes Ireland what it is and makes Dublin what it is. Dubliners has, for instance, if you've ever seen the movie, it was John Huston's very last movie, The Dead. A very beautiful film, magnificent achievement, with his daughter Angelica Huston and the wonderful Donald McCann, who I think I've mentioned before in some of these talks. The Dead was it was also made into a musical, which PICT did a few years back. Same story. And then on top of that, there was a book called The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which I think came out in 1916. It might have been slightly later that it was finally published. Another wonderful account of how, I mean, you could almost say, how does an artist evolve? And this book sort of describes it. He tried to write it a few times. I'll come to that in a minute. And then, of course, his final monumental work, Finnegan's Wake. And Finnegan's Wake is an exercise in language and sound. It is an internal monologue as well, but it is a kind of, I mean, the exercise of language and sound is so extraordinary. It is a very difficult book to read. I have never succeeded, and I'm not bad at reading, but maybe I just haven't made the effort greatly enough. But one of the wonderful things about Finnegan's Wake is it's circular. It follows a perfect circle, and it ends at the beginning. The opening moments, which the opening phrase, "River run past Eve and Adam," with the Adam and Eve church on the River Liffey, river run, the river, and ends with the phrase, "All the river run." So all the, and again, river run past even that. So he wrote this thing in a sort of perfect circle. It's a monumental piece of work. I know people who can grasp it and get it. I mean, my dear friend David Norris, the Irish senator and teacher in Trinity College, is one of the world's experts on this particular novel. And nobody reads it quite like him because some of the language in it is almost unspeakable, and yet he does it. So I know it works, and I can listen to it. I just find it so hard to read. Anyway, those are the four principal pieces of literature that came out of him. He also wrote a play called Exiles, which, trust me, is not very good. People say, why didn't you do Joyce's Exiles? Because it's terrible. Anyway, Ulysses was the landmark work in this sense. And he spent time writing. He didn't knock off a novel. He spent inordinate amount of time perfecting the phrase, perfecting the image, perfecting that stream of consciousness, giving a reality to thought. I just lost my notes there. Here we go. And because of this, and as I said before, the notion of novel writing was almost inverted. It was turned on its head. Instead of talking about what and why, it started talking about how I felt about it, how I perceived it, how I see it. So he also, apart from creating a novel that was almost a geographical homage to the city, to the physical city, he also filled it, like good writers do, with characters who would resemble his own family members, friends from his time there, students, fellow students. There's Francis Sheehy Skeffington, Oliver St. John Gogarty, another writer, who was also a surgeon, who was also in college with him. These people all became the basis of characters in the book. For instance, Oliver St. John Gogarty was the character, or was the template for the character who opens the book, and I'll come to that again. He had difficulty publishing because nothing had ever been written like this, and people didn't want to take the risk. And also, we lived in a world that was, shall we say, somewhat more Puritan than the world we live in today. But in fact, he was first, the first person to actually introduce him to the public was the founder of Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith, who had a newspaper called the United Irishman. And this, again, was prior to the Easter Rising, where the whole Irish independent movement took a different journey. But in 1901, Arthur Griffith wrote a piece in the United Irishman because Joyce had written a piece about the Irish literary theatre, which was beginning to develop, and W.B. Yeats and Edward Martin and others were beginning to create this movement towards what one might describe as a theatre of the nation. Oscar Wilde had also said that Ireland will never truly be a nation until it has a national theatre, and he didn't mean a building, he meant a theatre of the nation. And that's where Yeats was moving, and eventually did achieve with the Abbey Theatre. So anyway, Joyce wrote an article about this, and his college magazine refused to print it. So Griffith wrote a piece just decrying the censorship of the student James Joyce, little thinking that he was being deeply prophetic, because Joyce, they would try to censor Joyce for most of his creative life. It was what I think his notoriety far exceeded his success. Now, that was in 1901. 1904 was a very significant year for the young James Joyce. On January the 7th that year, he'd attempted to publish a piece, an essay story called Portrait of an Artist, which was dealing all with aesthetics and concepts and what have you, and it was rejected. So he went. It was on his 22nd birthday. He made the decision. I'm going to revise the story into a novel, and I'm going to call it Stephen Hero. The hero of the novel is actually Stephen Dedalus, who materializes in Ulysses. It was basically a sort of a fictional story of Joyce's own youth and his own development. He completely hated it. He got very frustrated with it, abandoned it, and it was much later, years later in Trieste, that he finally rewrote it as a portrait of an artist as a young man. And that's the novel that we have today. In fact, Stephen Hero was subsequently published some years back, but Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man is a glorious book. Again, much more accessible than you would imagine. But, as I said, that was 1904. And in 1904, he met a young lady from Galway. She was working as a chambermaid in a Dublin house, and her name was Nora Barnacle. Their relationship and their subsequent marriage was, to say the least, extremely physical. There was a dwelling upon the physicality of their relationship that invaded his letters. Reading his letters to her is almost sex education. But on the 16th of June in 1904, they had their first outing together, their first date, walking to the Dublin suburb of Ringsend, which is sort of at the mouth of the River Liffey, where Nora, shall we say, gave him a degree of satisfaction. This event was commemorated by providing the date of the action of Ulysses as Bloomsday, the 16th of June, 1904, when Joyce and Nora had their first encounter. Now, the young Joyce was drinking heavily. He had, as we would say in the old country, a taste for it. And after one of his drinking binges, he got into a fight on St. Stephen's Green in Dublin. This man, they just having a row and do a fight, and the fella floored him. And he was basically picked up by, literally off the ground, by a guy who knew his father, a guy called Alfred Hunter. And Hunter took him to his home and sort of cleaned him up and dressed his wounds. Hunter was, it is believed Hunter was, and a lot of Jewish people in Dublin didn't use Jewish names because there was a prejudice, so they would change their names. And Hunter was reputed to be a Jew and to have an unfaithful wife. And he was, it was he who served as one of the models for Leopold Bloom, the protagonist of Ulysses. As I said, Joyce would draw upon friends, acquaintances, everything. He wanted to create a kind of reality to all of these characters. He didn't just make them up. He took people he knew and reconstructed them, put thoughts into their head. He took up with the medical student I mentioned before, Oliver St. John Gogarty, and he was sort of the basic groundwork character for Buck Mulligan in Ulysses, who you meet in the very first chapter and later on in the book as well, but particularly in the opening chapter of Telemachus. Gogarty lived in all the way around Dublin Bay. There are Martello Towers that were built during the Napoleonic Wars in case Napoleon's navy decided to invade. So they built these huge round towers with cannons on the top, and they were to sink the ships of Napoleon. They never came, but The towers are there, and there are several of them still around the coastline of Dublin Bay, and you can see them. And the most famous one is in Sandy Cove, and that was where Gogarty was staying, and that is the home in the book of Buck Mulligan. That's where the book begins. But when Joyce stayed there in that Martello Tower with Gogarty, he left in the middle of one of the nights because he'd had an altercation with another student who was also staying there, a very unstable gentleman called Dermot Trench. In Ulysses, he becomes the character of Haynes. And Trench fired a pistol, which managed to hit some of the pans hanging directly over Joyce's head. So Joyce left, walked 8 miles back to Dublin, stayed with relatives, sent a friend the next day to pack his trunk, and very shortly after that, Joyce and Nora left Ireland to live in Europe and never fully returned. So, on top of that, and needless to say, the book had a very rocky history regarding its publication. It was actually Ezra Pound who arranged serial publication of the novel in the magazine The Little Review, which was started in March 1918. And of course, the serial publication provoked the first accusations of obscenity with which the book would be identified for so long. Now, when you do read the book, you may ask yourself, what obscenity? Well, yeah, it was, when you consider it was being published in magazine form, so like literally a chapter at a time, although there is virtually no physical action in terms of sexuality, they keep thinking about it. So you get the stream of consciousness going. And very frank, intimate musings, which were seen to offend, the church was offended by it, the state was offended by it, and because of the idea that people were thinking about it, thinking about sex. Maybe the book touched the guilty conscience of those whose very own musings were of a similar nature. There's nothing quite like a guilt-laden politician or a guilt-laden church teacher to bring out the tub thumping of we must abolish all of this. It's always it's interesting to know that those who scream loudest about of being anti-gay, anti-LGBT are the ones who suddenly we discover were child molesters all along. Guilt is a terrible, terrible thing in what it does to art. So anyway, the publication of the novel had tremendous problems. The New York postal authorities, this is lovely, the serialization ground to a halt. The editors were convicted of publishing obscenity. This meant that the Postal Service couldn't deal with it because they were considered to be handling obscene material. The editors of the magazine were published with publishing obscenity, 1921. And the whole conviction was based on one chapter. It's the chapter called Nausicaa, an episode in Ulysses. Nothing really untoward happens in the chapter, but an awful lot of it is thought about. And that stream of consciousness, divil in the back of the head, convinced people that this was an absolutely obscene publication. So the book itself, the novel as a book, was never published in the United States till 1934. And he found it very difficult to get a publisher to actually publish the book. It was originally published in Europe by a company in Paris, Shakespeare and Company. English edition published in the same year. That ran into difficulties with the American authorities. 500 copies that were shipped to the States were seized and probably destroyed. The following year, there was a print run of another 500 intended to replace the missing copies. These were captured and burnt by the English customs officials in Folkestone at the quayside, where they were about to be shipped to America. Fortunately for America, such foul obscenities were being destroyed, almost burnt at the stake in the UK before they could taint the purity of the American soil. In Ireland, the book remained banned for many, many years, and so, believe it or not, was the movie of the book, made by Joseph Strick, and it starred Milo O'Shea, wonderful Irish actor. That movie was banned in Ireland even after it was being seen everywhere else in the world. One could understand that Joyce's objection, as I say, to the oppressing big foot of Irish Catholicism was still holding back his book from the good people of Ireland for years and years after everybody else could read it. He died in 1941. He had a perforated ulcer, and he was in Zurich. His wife and son were literally on their way to see him, but he died before they got there. He was just basically a month short of his 59th birthday. He was a young man by any comparison. They buried him in Zurich. Ireland had a wonderfully unforgiving nature, and the Irish diplomats who were actually in Switzerland at the time did not attend Joyce's funeral. He was famous by this stage, possibly infamous, but he was a man of significant literary achievement. And the Irish government also declined Nora's offer to permit the repatriation of his remains, to bring his body back to Ireland. The Irish government said no. There was a secretary in the Department of External Affairs, like the equivalent of the Secretary of State here, a guy called Joseph Walsh. When he was informed of Joyce's death, he sent a telegram to the Irish representatives in Switzerland. I quote, "Please wire details of Joyce's death. If possible, find out, did he die a Catholic?" To be fair, Ireland has come a long way since those days, and Joyce's writing can take much credit for that liberation of thinking that his writing propagated, that idea that what we are is very much what we think, and when what we think is actually turned into action, we can change the world. Ireland, since that time, and in the last 20-odd years, 30 years, we've abandoned the constitutional special position of the Catholic Church. It's taken out of the Constitution. We've abandoned the constitutional ban on divorce. Women now have the right to choose. We abandoned the laws that prevented that. And most proud of, well, I'm proud of all of those things, but one of the things that was remarkable, I think we were the first country in Europe with full same-sex marriage. And to think that that happened in the Holy Catholic of Ireland that James Joyce ran from, I think Joyce would be delighted. Nora survived him by 10 years, and she's buried right beside his side, as is their son, Giorgio, who died in 1976. That sort of line ended, but the bequest to art and to literature is eternal. There are very few writers you can say that about, but I think Joyce's bequest to art and to literature is eternal, because in this one book that I seriously encourage you to try, read Portrait of an Artist first if you've never read any Joyce, and then go to Ulysses. There are plenty of commentaries that you can have by your side as you're reading it. If you find that you get lost in it, go back to the commentaries and they will take you through it. There are an awful lot of them, but it is worth the effort. And when you come to us on Tuesday, as I hope you do, on Bloomsday, and listen to some of our artists reading it, realize that this is not just a story. that this is a stream of consciousness. And in a way, one of your best options, as I say with a lot of other, as I said with some of Wilde, as I say with Shakespeare, and we're going to be doing a whole course on Shakespeare later in the summer, read it aloud. Read it and listen to it. Listen to the words. Listen to the sound and the way the sound of the words work. But whatever you do, read it. It is an entire education in the art of storytelling and the process of thinking a story. It is remarkable. Now, have we got any questions? I bet we have, and I bet I can't answer them. But we'll have a look. Hazel, yes, I think, in fact, yes, I have, and I agree with you. Alan Moore's Jerusalem. Do I think Moore owes a debt to James Joyce? Yes, I think most modern novelists owe a debt to James Joyce. You often find that you scratch a modern novelist deep enough, you'll find that James Joyce is one of those that he has read or she has read. The influence of and you can take almost any chapter of the book and look at it as a separate entity. And when you know, all right, what chapter, what are we paralleling in Homer's Odyssey? What are we paralleling in the social world of Dublin in 1904? Once you grasp that and look at it, and we were not doing all the in our readings, we're only doing 8 of the chapters, and there are 18 of them. And next year we'll do some different ones. But each chapter in itself is an object lesson, is a lesson in writing that I think pretty much all modern authors owe a debt to. Oh yes, if not Bloom's, whose son is Stephen? He's his father's son, and I'm not going to go too. Once you get going on this, you go down alleyways of themes. He is, by the way, Daedalus is an important name. Daedalus was the father of Icarus, and who flew too close to the sun. Daedalus said, "No, let's not go that way." Dublin, Ireland, the Catholic Church, Joyce's. Well, oh, in that sense, yes. Dublin's, Ireland's, the Catholic Church, or Joyce's. Stephen is a victim just as much of Dublin and Ireland, but particularly Dublin, and the Catholic Church as Joyce was. And in fact, in Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, there is the famous sermon on hell, where you were is it the Christian Brother or the Jesuit? I can't remember. Does a sermon on the nature of hell with walls 1,000 miles thick and the burning, screaming. Almost all young people in Ireland were subjected to this savage view of creation and punishment and eternity of hell. It's still happening here in America, let's be honest about it. And the various religious orders, and this, would have their own particular view and their own particular sense of what sinners we were and how we would go. All young people suffered from that. Thankfully, that's gone, I hope. No, I agree with you. Others were doing this notion of somebody signed Norton. Others were doing this. The experiments were happening. The discoveries were being made. My argument is that Joyce culminated that in this particular book, that entire concept was brought to a kind of fruition, a kind of perfection. There is no such thing as perfection in art. There is no such thing as perfection in anything. But in Ulysses, a kind of perfection was achieved. So yes, I agree with you. Others use the interior monologue or the stream of consciousness, but to my mind, the notion of it was perfected in this particular book, and I have no doubt because as I say, he was James Joyce was a highly articulate, sparklingly intelligent person and very, very well read. Nobody comes up, there is nothing new under the heavens. Everything is a new variation on a theme that has gone before. All we ever do is reconsider, reevaluate, and restructure. I have never done an original production in my life, and yet every production I've done has been new. All I am doing is, what was the Einstein phrase? We stand on the shoulders of giants. We learn from those that we see, those that we hear, and if we have any skill or talent at all, we move forward. We take those thoughts that others have had and we move forward another stage. And hopefully people will come after us and move those forward as well. Whatever we have to write, whatever we have to perform, whatever we have to teach, we're not just teaching to the people, the next generation, but to the one beyond that, because the people you teach will teach them. I think that he most certainly was influenced by other writers, but as I hold to the argument that in this particular novel, he came as close to perfecting the concept as anybody did, and this is the novel that had the huge, almost universal impact. So I don't disagree with you. Most Dangerous Book by Kevin Birmingham, all about, that's just a recommendation of a book by Kevin Birmingham, quote, The Most Dangerous Book, unquote. All about the publication history. Yes, I mean, there are plenty of books written about this, and read them. Yeah, it's a fascinating history, the whole thing. I've only scratched the surface. I just want to give you a flavor and an introduction to it. That is correct, Kathleen. First publication was on Joyce's 40th birthday in Paris by Sylvia Beach, owner of Shakespeare & Co. That is absolutely correct. It was, I imagine, for him, one of the greatest possible celebrations of a birthday he could have wished for. What excites me about participating in the Bloomsday celebration is Dublin. It is quintessentially Dublin. We've been doing it in Dublin for a very long time. As I say, we had a big reading fest every year, and I was the master of ceremonies. It's actually my first acquaintance, being in Pittsburgh now, with Dan Rooney of Steelers fame, but he was also the American ambassador to Ireland, and his wonderful wife Patricia came on one of those occasions and did a reading of Joyce for us at that Bloomsday celebration. It is a part and parcel of what is quintessentially Dublin. There are things that are quintessentially Dublin. The picture that we're using for the promotion of this Bloomsday reading is of the Halfpenny Bridge in Dublin. That is so. It's a footbridge across the River Liffey. It's very old. In fact, I was saying to my colleague Catherine the other day that a good few years back now, maybe 15 years, 20. The bridge had to be reconditioned. It's that curved bridge with the lamps on the top across the river, and it's built in cast iron. So the original manufacturers were brought in to completely recondition the bridge, and it was only then that many of us discovered that the bridge was actually built by the firm Harland and Wolff, who built the Titanic. So that we have all been walking across a bridge built by the people who built the most famous shipwreck in history. Just a little disconcerting. But yeah, that's why Bloomsday, I think, it's a Dublin thing. It is that celebration because the book in itself, apart from the journey that Bloom takes, is a celebration of the city. And he takes you street by street, corner by corner, bar, pub by pub. There's one other famous Joyce quote, how do you walk across Dublin without passing any bars? You go into every one of them. But there are places, if you do the trip to Dublin, if you're in Dublin, do the James Joyce tour, because you'll find on all the way around the journey that Leopold Bloom took, you'll find little brass plaques in the sidewalk telling you where he was on the journey. It's as though it really happened. There is even a small cottage near the Grand Canal in Dublin. And on the front of it, it's got a blue plaque that says, that tells you the birthday and that Leopold Bloom was born in that house in the imagination of James Joyce. They take it so absolutely seriously. It's a wonderful, wonderful, I suppose you might say it is a citywide celebration of a work of art that is based purely and totally upon that city. The city celebrates itself, and that's why I think it's important to me, why I enjoy it so much. Anything else? There is someone in Seattle who is currently memorizing all of Finnegan's Wake. Oh, may God be good to them. I admire that enormously. The things that people do. I once, many years ago, I'll tell you another little sidebar. Years ago, I was running a thing called the Project Art Centre in Dublin. It's still there. It's now the biggest art house theatre in the city. And I remember I was sitting in there one day, and there were two young Americans came in. They were very bearded. This is back in the early 70s, so sort of bearded and woolly hats, and very came in, and they wanted to do a workshop in our theatre because they'd come up with the conclusion that Leopold Bloom was in fact the famous Dr. Crippen, and Molly Bloom was his wife who he murdered, and Gertie McDowell was the young woman that he ran off with, that Crippen ran off with, and all based on the fact that Molly Bloom was a singer and so was Dr. No. Now, I sat and listened to them. I gave them a good 20 minutes and then said no. But one of the other wonderful things about this particular book is that there are more conspiracy theories about this book than you could ever wish to have to plow through. People become obsessed with it, just as they become obsessed with Finnegan's Wake. And the fact that there is somebody who is trying very hard to memorize the entirety of Finnegan's Wake, God help them. What was this one? Could it be the idea of wandering and the concept of the wanderer in Ulysses, parallel in the Odyssey? The role of wandering is described. Yes. Well, in all of classic literature, the journey is one of the sort of fundamental themes, isn't it? The notion, I mean, in all storytelling, we have journeys. If you like, I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. Shakespeare's King Lear, I always describe as the journey play, in that there are so many journeys, some of them physical, some of them intellectual. But journeys are a wonderful storytelling narrative. Now, in Lear, we have, the journey of Lear to madness and back to sanity. We have the journey of Gloucester to discover that everything he believed is wrong, that he has to lose his sight in order to gain insight. We have the journey to Dover, where Gloucester throws himself off. We have the journey of Edmund, who starts as absolutely nothing and becomes within moments of being king. We have the journey of a letter that could change the entire course of the play. So journey as a concept is a tremendously powerful literary concept. And in this, well, Homer's story, well, we know that Troy existed pretty much. How much of the story of the Trojan War is made up, we do not know. We don't even know that Homer was one person or half a dozen people. What we know is that the story exists, and not merely the story of the Trojan War, but the consequence that Ulysses, or Odysseus, whichever you want to call him, angered the gods, and as punishment, he didn't get home for 12 years. And that his wife waited. Now, in the book, Ulysses, she fantasizes and is having an affair with another guy, but he's only paralleling. He's not writing a version of Homer's book. He's using Homer's book as a structure upon which to base his own story. But the notion of the journey is an incredibly potent and oft-used methodology for telling a story, because a journey is something we all understand. We all start on a journey. We all want the journey to continue, and sometimes we want it to stop. But the notion of the journey is incredibly, it's there throughout all of literature. And when you look at it, you take the movie was made near here, which that novel Road, that post-Holocaustic novel Road. The journey, survival is based on the journey. Survival is based on the capacity to move on. Why Beckett's play Waiting for Godot is such a play of despair, because of that one line at the end of each of the two acts. Shall we go? Yes, let's go. They do not move. Without the capacity to make the journey, there is no growth and there is no development, and there's all of those things. Yeah. Mel Brooks had a lot of references to Bloomsday and Joyce in his show movie, The Producers. Yes, he did. One of the main characters is Leo Bloom, of course. What have we got there? The evening scene at Bethesda Fountain in Central Park, Leo asks, when will it be Bloomsday? Well, I mean, Mel Brooks is a huge fan. And if you've seen the original Producers, which is by far the best, if you've seen the original Producers, you will know it is riddled with Joycean imagery. Oh yeah, and there you are. That's the other one, which is one of those great little bits of trivia that the calendar on the wall of Bialystok's office is the 16th of June. It is in fact Bloomsday. And that is also true. Is there going to be a reading, Joe? Yes, I was mentioning, I'm going to just describe it again now. On Tuesday, we're not going to have a webinar next Friday. We'll be back the following Friday, and I'll tell you about that in a second. But on Tuesday, which is the 16th of June, starting at noon, we are going to have 8 readings from the book. Every hour on the hour. It's not an hour long. They'll be about 15, 16 minutes long. But each hour on the hour, noon, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, we are going to read from one of the chapters of the book. So we're going to get readings from 8 chapters. The readings are going to be by PICT actors. You'll recognize them and you'll know their faces and you'll know their voices. And it's just to introduce you to the book. For those of you, sometimes there are those of you who've traveled around the city with us in years gone by to various bars and restaurants as we've read chapters of the book. Obviously, we can't do that now. So we're doing it as a Zoom for this year. Hopefully next year we'll be back live. But for this year, we just have to play safe. So if you want to watch it, you don't have to watch it all. You can watch some of them, miss some, depending on your timetable. But each hour on the hour, on Tuesday the 16th, which is next Tuesday, on Bloomsday, from noon and finishing at the 7 o'clock reading, we will take 8 chapters of the book and read a small section of each of them. We would look for your donations. As usual, you can donate on our Facebook. You can donate on our web page. You can donate, hit the big red button. But the donations that you give us on Bloomsday do not go to PICT. They go to the artists. Each of those 8 artists, and believe me, theatre artists are suffering very badly at the moment, and we don't know when we'll be able to put them back on stage again. So we're doing everything in our power to give as much engagement and employment to our artists as we can. So on Bloomsday, there's no charge to watch this. It's a Zoom exercise. But we would ask you, please send donations, and all the money that you send on that day will be divided between those 8 artists. So that's what's coming up. Will you lose the story if you skip a reading? No, you won't. And we're going to have a short introduction. My colleague Catherine is going to be reading a very brief introduction to each of them, but it is to introduce you to the story. We're not going to tell the entire story. We're just going to give you a taste of some of those chapters. Do we register in order to have the link sent? No, you don't need to. You just go to the website and hit the link, and that'll take you onto it. Should we have a Guinness with each reading? If you have the stomach for it. Personally, I would start noon, 2, 3, 4, 5 with the Guinness, and then I move on to the Jameson. But that's just me. But I mean, there's no harm in a glass of Guinness. 8 of them might be a bit much. Anyway, that's it. So, as I said, Bloomsday next week, Tuesday, Not next Friday, but we will have lots of information coming out to you, because the Friday after that, we're going to be talking about the New York famous Algonquin Circle, the circle of writers and intellects who sat around in the Algonquin Hotel and got drunk. That's in 2 weeks' time. Tuesday. Please join us for Bloomsday. Thank you for being with us. Have a wonderful weekend.